You're watching 12 WKRC TV, a new generation of news. This is 12 Newsmakers.
And yes, we'll call for a vote. No matter what the whip count is, we're calling for the vote. We want to see people stand up and say what their opinion is about Saddam Hussein and the utility of the United Nations Security Council. And so, you bet, it's time for people to show their cards, to let the world know where they stand when it comes to Saddam.
Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. After months of posturing and maneuvering, President Bush made it clear that we are in the final stages of diplomacy. The United States will force a vote at the United Nations Security Council next week, but seemingly, no matter what the outcome, the United States is on the brink of war with or without broad international support. I am reluctant normally to try to tackle international issues on Newsmakers. The networks can do a better job. This is essentially a locally focused forum of ideas. But when it comes to issues of international law, the United Nations, and human rights, Cincinnati has an important resource. The Urban Morgan Institute at the University of Cincinnati College of Law was founded in 1979 and is the oldest endowed institute in an American school of law devoted to the study of international human rights law. I am joined this morning by Bert Lockwood, the director of the Urban Morgan Institute and the editor-in-chief of the Human Rights Quarterly, and Howard Tolley, a professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati, a graduate of the Urban Morgan Institute, and currently the director of Teaching Human Rights Online, a wonderful resource that I would encourage people to look at your website and take for themselves. And welcome back to Newsmakers in both of your cases. What sort of power in terms of international law, Bert, does a vote at the UN Security Council really have? What difference does it make in a legal sense?
Well, in a legal sense, the Security Council resolutions are the only binding part of the organic law of the United Nations. In other words, they are recognized as binding international law. It is a little ironic, the first time that the Security Council ever invoked Chapter 7, which is what we're acting under presently, what we're asking for, where they voted mandatory economic sanctions against Southern Rhodesia, the only country in the world that openly violated them was the United States. So there's a certain irony behind that.
Are there implications if the United Nations takes a vote next week? What are the implications in terms of if the Security Council either vote, they don't muster 9 votes in favor of the United States, or one of the permanent members vetoes that? Howard, what are the legal implications of that for the United States? If, in other words, if we don't win, if there's a formal decision not to support our position?
If we then attack Iraq, we are in violation of Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter that forbids the threat or the use of force and gives a monopoly to the Security Council to do that. It won't be the first time in our history that the United States has undertaken military action without UN approval. But since World War II, our leadership viewed collective security authorized formally as in our national interest. We used it in Korea in the 50s. We used it in the Gulf War in 1991. And at this juncture, where we are the lone remaining superpower, it would send a signal that the new world order envisioned by our government does not necessarily include this 50-year-old system.
So the President cast this as a question of whether the UN has any future and whether it's relevant ongoing into the future. What you're saying is it's the United States that may be making the decision to isolate and eliminate the UN as an effective future force.
He didn't address all of the non-security aspects of the United Nations, which are mammoth. And he did somewhat hint that he views this as a matter of self-defense. Article 51 of the UN Charter, in fact, authorizes that, but certainly it is to be coupled with the Security Council coming to the aid of the victim of aggression. And this type of a preventive war is certainly nothing contemplated by the American founders of the United Nations.
I think, Dan, if I may, that it needs to be said to be fair that, in fact, the human rights community, the non-governmental human rights community, in recent years has been one of the most forceful proponents of the use of military force in some situations where we didn't intervene.
Like Rwanda.
Like in Rwanda with the genocide.
Right.
And I think it's fair to say that the Bosnian intervention was largely because of pressure from the human rights community. So I think it's important not to sort of view that community as pacifist or against the use of military
in that
force.
context, one of the things I was thinking about, I mean, no matter where you stand on the question of war against Iraq, nobody wants to defend Saddam Hussein in terms of his human rights record. I mean, it's abysmal.
In fact, many in the human rights community wanted U.S. military intervention at the time he was gassing the Kurds. And there were arguments that we never would have had the Gulf War if we had promptly enforced international human rights law. The bombing of Kosovo was done without approval by the UN Security Council, and many in the human rights community considered it a just war, the title of one of the cases on the Teaching Human Rights Online website you mentioned.
So the fact that the United Nations doesn't stand with us on this doesn't necessarily mean that the human rights community would be opposed to the United States action. Theoretically.
Theoretically, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's not. Yes.
What does this?
But in practice, the organizations have regarded the way we have conducted these wars as potentially in violation of the laws of war, with high-altitude bombing.
Well, given that, and especially if, for example, we do not win at the UN next week, if the United States does not win at the UN next week, what does that open up in terms of post-war international community coming back on the United States for its violations of accepted international practice on war? I mean, are we liable to war crimes? Do we open ourselves up even more if in fact we force a vote at the UN and lose?
Well, realistically, I don't think that's going to be the outcome in terms of there being any prosecutions against the United States. There really isn't a body that would have jurisdiction over the U.S. With the International Criminal Court if they were...
Iraq has not ratified the treaty creating a new international criminal court, and your soldiers are subject to its jurisdiction if they commit war crimes on the territory of a state that has ratified. There were charges brought against U.S. pilots in the Kosovo War at the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia because the allegations were that we committed war crimes in Kosovo. But the prosecutor there did not take those up. And our Congress has adopted the American Service Members Protection Act, which authorizes our military to rescue any of our personnel who are taken into custody by this new international criminal court.
Okay, so given that, let's talk though, let's assume that one way or the other, with or without United Nations approval, we're going to go to war. Another assumption that we win that war militarily. Now we're talking post-war situation in Iraq. What obligations in international law does the United States face if we become the victors in terms of redeveloping, reconstituting Iraq? What are our responsibilities in a legal sense?
I'm not sure that's clear in terms of a legal sense. The obligations. It's clear that we will want to have a stability in that region, and the likelihood is that it's going to be an unstable area. I mean, I think one of the reasons that has been of such concern to so many people is that Iraq looks like it, after a successful military venture, is going to break apart. I mean, there are all sorts of rivalries there.
Especially in the north with the Kurds.
Yeah, and if we haven't really brought the international community behind us, it's clearly in our interest to try to get the United Nations to play a peace-building role in the aftermath. And I'm not sure that the way our diplomacy has been focused at this point, where we really seem to be disregarding the United Nations, that we're going to find a great deal of support.
I'm unaware of any legal obligation. There would be moral and political. We rebuilt Japan and Western Europe with the Marshall Plan after World War II. We have offered reconstruction aid to Afghanistan, but the only legal duty would come if we had a treaty with that government promising aid and then a responsibility to deliver. Apparently there was an oversight and no money for Afghanistan rebuilding was included in the budget. So the United Nations has a moral responsibility and a legal responsibility to rescue refugees. There is a UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So these are mandates that they have, but I know of no duty on a country to make good damage caused in war.
What about, again, post-war situation, assuming we win, what happens if we capture Saddam Hussein and or other leaders of the current Iraqi government? What can we do legally? I mean, we've accused them of all sorts of crimes, from the gassing of their own people to hiding weapons against the United Nations command, all those things. What about war crimes with captured Iraqi leadership? Who does it? Do we do it? Do we turn them over to The Hague? What do we do?
We have already enemy combatants from Afghanistan. Our president has claimed the authority to create military tribunals, but even our regular courts have jurisdiction under the principle of universal jurisdiction for some violations of the most fundamental international laws. We've already seen Spain and Belgium go after Pinochet from Chile, Sharon from Israel.
But the precedent that would be most likely, and it's another reason for trying to work with the Security Council, is that in the former Yugoslavia, the Security Council authorized the setting up of an international tribunal, which has been trying. Milosevic is on trial presently. It clearly would be ideal in terms of the perception of justice to be able to turn those individuals over to an international court as opposed to having the United States try them. But again, if we are sort of flaunting the Security Council the way we appear to be at this point, I mean, it's difficult, I think, to go back to the Security Council and expect them to assist you in setting up an international tribunal.
We have about a minute and a half left. I want to go back almost to the beginning. From your perspective, human rights perspective, international law perspective, are we smart to force this vote, and because it may go against us, or are we smarter to walk away from the Security Council and say we're going to go it alone, but we're not going to force a vote?
What's the lesser evil? I don't favor the options you lay out, but
they're about the only options left.
Have greater foreboding about an overwhelming repudiation of the United States, which is ignored. We practiced that type of policy during the 60s in Vietnam, and I think our nation suffered.
Bert, any final thought?
Just that it's obviously clearly preferable if we could get the support of the United Nations before going in, and I would be opposed to going in alone.
Well, thank you very much. I want to make clear that we're taping this on Friday morning. A lot could happen over the weekend before this is aired on Sunday morning, but I appreciate your being here. I appreciate the work that you do at the university, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Stay tuned. After the break, I'll be joined by A.G. Lafley, the president of Procter & Gamble, and this year's chairman of the Fine Arts Campaign. Welcome back. Greater Cincinnati is currently in the midst of the 54th annual Fine Arts Fund Drive. In 2002, the campaign raised a little more than $9.3 million. This year, despite a sluggish economy and the threat of impending war, the goal is $9.6 million. The Fine Arts Fund supports 17 arts organizations. 89% of the money raised is allocated to the so-called Big Eight, led by the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, which gets the largest allocation at $2.7 million and includes the Art Museum, the Playhouse in the Park, the Opera, the Ballet, the Contemporary Arts Center, the May Festival, and the Taft Museum of Art. Another 3.6% of the money is devoted to the support of 9 other institutions, such as the Cincinnati Shakespeare Festival, the Fitton Center in Hamilton, the Northern Kentucky Symphony Orchestra, and the Arts Consortium of Cincinnati, which gets the smallest institutional allocation at about $29,000. The rest of the money is distributed by grants. 10 days ago, I sat down with A.G. Lafley, the president and CEO of Procter & Gamble and the chair of the 2003 Fine Arts Campaign. We met in the new John Pepper Training Center at P&G headquarters. I began by asking him why a corporation like P&G is willing to spend so much energy and time raising money for the fine arts. In short, why are the arts important to Cincinnati?
In Cincinnati, I think there are 3 roles for the arts. First and foremost is I think it enriches the lives of the citizens of Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. Secondly, I think it's an economic driver in the greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think we brought something like $170 million worth of economic value into this area last year. And thirdly, I think the arts are a great educator and developer of children. Over 500,000 kids attended at least one musical, performing, or visual arts opportunity last year, and I think it's proven that kids that get involved in the arts do better in school and develop in life.
Why are corporations like Procter & Gamble willing to spend so much money and also time and energy raising money for the fine arts in the city? Why are the arts so important to this community?
We recruit at a wide range of schools across the U.S. and around the world. We have to recruit against the best companies in the world and against the best other options, you know, whether it's law or medicine or whatever else a young, talented university graduate can aspire to. So we have to compete against New York and San Francisco and Chicago, you can imagine. So for us, it's critically important that the quality of life be good in Cincinnati. And one of the prime characteristics we point to is the arts opportunity. And if you look at the range and the quality of our arts offerings, they compare pretty favorably with some of the biggest and best cities in the world.
At times, the arts stir controversy. That's the case with the current project at Playhouse in the Park, where you're a trustee, to commission and produce a new play entitled Paradise, focusing on the Middle East crisis. Some people think that the goal of the corporate community in the arts is to kill anything that raises controversy. What do you say to that?
I guess I'd say 3 things. First of all, there is no corporate entity or corporate citizen or stereotype here at P&G. We're an incredibly diverse organization with employees from virtually every country in the world, from the most diverse group I've ever worked with in my life. Secondly, because we're very much involved in the world economy and all that comes with that, we are used to a lot of change, unpredictable change, and a very fast pace of change. So I would say, you have to at least become comfortable with change, and we try to be proactive and get out in front and lead change and influence change wherever we can. And the third thing is we just have a tremendous range of interests here, and the arts are part of those interests.
Fine Arts Fund is a very old effort here in Cincinnati, 54 years old. But the business community has been changing a lot, especially in the last couple of decades. There are fewer headquarter offices here in the city. More businesses are owned and headquartered someplace else. even companies like Procter & Gamble, headquartered here very importantly, but you are global in scope. You're not just a Cincinnati company by any means. How does that affect the ability of the business community to raise money for the fine arts?
Of course, it's more difficult when you have fewer concentrated headquarters to put together and execute a campaign like the Fine Arts Fund campaign or United Appeal or whatever. So what we have to do is we have to reach out. We have to reach out to the subsidiaries of the major companies who still have major operations here in this area. We have to reach out to the medium and smaller size companies. We have to reach out to the individual owners and entrepreneurs, and there are plenty of them. And we have to reach into the professional communities. We have to reach out to doctors and attorneys and healthcare professionals and on and on. So it means that the work we do to raise the money we need to support these organizations is more than it was in the past.
In the early years of the Fine Arts Fund, it was really focused on raising money simply for the largest of the arts organizations, the ballet, the symphony, the art museum, and now it's become the big 8. Now you also raise money for other organizations as well, but there's a lot of cultural organizations out there beyond what is immediately supported by the Fine Arts Fund. Is that a continuing question? Is that a continuing effort and discussion inside the Fine Arts Fund about what should and should not be funded?
Today we directly support 17 institutions, the big 8 plus 9 others. We also last year provided grants to another 70 to 75 arts organizations. So I think we are reaching into the counties and into the communities and trying to support, you know, arts in all forms and all types. I think the trend will be over time to continue to expand our support. Now, what the Fine Arts Fund Institute is always struggling with is the balance between, you know, how much funds can you raise, and are those funds sufficient to maintain, you know, good operations in the organizations that we do support.
There's a great deal of energy in the Cincinnati arts community right now. Just in the next few months, we're going to see a new contemporary arts center open. We're going to see an expansion of the Taft Museum of Art. Going to see a new Cincinnati gallery, the Cincinnati Art Museum. These are all investments in the infrastructure of the arts community. But sometimes it's easier to raise capital money than it is to raise the operating funds for the arts and for an organization. Do you worry about that Cincinnati's arts community is going to be too expensive to maintain and operate in coming years?
One of the conditions for Fine Arts Fund support is that the institution, the arts institution, be on good, firm financial footing. So I think we can maintain it. I think it's going to depend on 2 things. It's going to depend on whether when we build it and we perform it, they come. And so far, knock on wood, Cincinnatians and Northern Kentuckians and people from 34 states last year came to Cincinnati to go to an arts event or performance, and that's great. And that's one thing. We have to keep the attendance up. And the second thing we have to do is keep the support up, the financial support and also the volunteer support.
As the leader of the Fine Arts Fund this year in 2003, what would you say to people who work for businesses that may have an organized Fine Arts Fund drive inside the business, and also for those professionals and independent workers out there in the community who may not be reached automatically by their businesses? What would you say to them about contributing to the Fine Arts Fund?
Main message is the arts are for everyone. The arts touch everyone. So if you have attended one of the arts institutions in the last year, by all means, please continue to attend. If you're so inclined, please volunteer your time, and please support the Fine Arts Fund financially and the art organization of your choice financially. If you haven't had a chance to try or sample one of the many Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky arts organizations, please, by all means, do so. I'll be very surprised if you're not challenged if it isn't thought-provoking, and maybe you'll even be entertained.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and good luck with the Fine Arts Fund in 2003.
Thank you.
And thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the women and the men shaping our community for the future. Have a good week.